In 1915, the British Zionist minister, Herbert Samuel, submitted a secret document to the British cabinet titled The Future of Palestine, where he says that the idea of establishing a state for Jews in Palestine is perfect, but it can't be done without a full British mandate over the land. This mandate would ease the immigration and increases Jews to 4 million Jews. Then, in 1917, this suggestive document turned into a British declaration, known as the Balfour Declaration. A letter written by the British Exterior Minister, Arthur Balfour, who was a Zionist anti-Semitic Christian. You might say, what? Like how? I just told you. There's no Zionism without anti-Semitism. I will remind you again. The Zionist idea owe it to the anti-Semitic idea. Anyway, the Balfour Declaration promised establishing a national state for Jews. But there's a trick here. What's a national state for Jews? Does it mean that Europe's Jews would live in Palestine, which is under the British mandate? Or does it mean establishing an actual Jewish state with only Jewish population and ruled by them? What this exactly meant wasn't even clear to the British themselves, but at that time no one cared enough to clarify. Britain continued its plan to support Jews' immigration. In the same year, the British General Allenby will enter Jerusalem. He entered Jerusalem with a Jewish military corps, and with this crops a man called David Ben-Gurion. You may think that they went in like a hot knife through butter, but no. In 1918, Jews were about 50,000, while Palestinians were around 500,000. 85% of these Palestinians rejected the idea of a Jewish state. In fact, a committee sent by US President Wilson to examine the situation said that in order to achieve Mr. Balfour's declaration, it would require a military force of 50,000 soldiers. However, despite all that, Britain didn't give up, and they went on with their plan. Especially as World War I ended with Britain's victory against the Ottoman Empire. In 1920, the League of Nations, which is the UN's former organization name, granted Britain the mandate over Palestine. That's when Britain appoints Herbert Samuel as the first High Commissioner. This guy made everything so easy. From 1990 into 1921, the Jewish migrations would greatly increase, where 105,000 Jewish immigrants arrived, while the Jewish National Fund bought 240.00 valley northern of Palestine. With the idea of settlement turning into a full-scale European project, violent demonstrations spread across Palestine starting from Jaffa, where 95 Jewish and 64 Arabs died. Then Churchill announced in June 1922 the Churchill White Paper. This white paper by Churchill that's sent to the Palestinians shortly means, "Why are you worried, guys? Don't be so angry. I see no reason for you to be worried." Now I guess you know why they worried. Let me tell you that some sources indicate that Churchill was also anti-Semitic. So Churchill tried to calm the Arabs down and tell them, "Guys, the Jews won't occupy Palestine. They will just create a society in it, with what works for the nature of the country, its economy, and its population. Don't misjudge them." The truth is that the reality and future will beg to differ with Churchill. Jews were creating closed communities, ones that didn't blend with Palestinians but were made to replace them. It was to the extent that some Jewish towns were granted local autonomy, like Tel Aviv, which developed separate ministries of works, energy and water, education in a different language, and universities like the Hebrew University, which Balfour attended its opening himself. Things will stay that way for a while, until in 1929, when Jewish immigrant numbers started to double. Not only that, but in 1929, a Jewish prayer was organized in Jerusalem calling for the revival of the temple and claims their historical right in the Wailing Wall, which is called Burak Wall by Muslims. And the Jewish day of mourning the temple's destruction coincided with Prophet Muhammad's day of birth, which is a very holy day to all Muslims, and the Arabs call it Mawlid. Meanwhile, the Israeli know how important this day for Muslims, but the Israeli meant to do so in this specific day, so Palestinians got angry. That's the revolution we know as Burak Uprising in 1929. That's when Palestinians were dismayed by the violent oppression led by the British. They didn't only arrest hundreds of rebels, they executed the uprising leaders. The British treated Palestinians as if they were the Red Indians or the Black Australians. These are British colonizer terms given by the British to who they deem as barbaric people. Meanwhile, the immigrant Jews are not that. They are civilized white Europeans. They stupidly believe that white on the outside, white on the inside. The Israeli historian Ilam Papi says that the people of Palestine were described in the letters between Balfour, Churchill, and Herbert Samuel, using words like Arabs or Mohammedans. The word Arab at the time wasn't like the one we know now. At the time, Arab meant nomadic or primitive, the picture of camels and tents. And Mohammedans didn't mean Muslims, it meant the followers of Prophet Muhammad. But these letters reflect a point of view where the white colonizers see Palestinians as a part of primitive groups who don't have an identity or privacy, as if they were primitive tribes that unfortunately happened to be living there. Winston Churchill will later bluntly say, "I do not agree that the inner manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time." This cunt means that a dog being in a farmhouse doesn't give him the right to own the farmhouse, even if he has been there for a while. Do you know who he meant by that? You think that he meant the Palestinians only, right? Actually, he meant all the natives of America, Australia, and Palestine. But who has the right to rule these lands according to Churchill? The civilized Europeans, whether they're British or Jewish. And according to that, the Jewish immigrations continue until they reach 27% of the population in 1935, from 3% to 27%. And revolutions against them never stopped, revolutions against the unfair British colonization. And one of the major revolutionists was a Syrian guy from Al-Azhar University who turned from a preacher at the Istiklal Mosque in Haifa to a leader of an armed movement against the British. His name is Izz al-Din al-Qassam. He was joined by thousands of volunteers who gave him ammunition and weapons. But the occupation succeeded in killing Izz al-Din al-Qassam in an unfair battle. Al-Qassam's funeral will turn into the heart of the people's movement in Palestine. This movement turned later into a complete revolt from April to October of 1936. It was the spark of the Great Arab Revolt. The British were disoriented by the revolt. They probably were surprised that the dog in the manger was resisting. Between 1936 and 1937, the British killed 1,000 Palestinians and arrested anyone who took part in the revolution. And then they would blow up his home and destroy it. In Jaffa only, more than 200 houses were demolished. Britain gave the Jewish settlers everything, my friend. They facilitated their immigration, created areas with tight Jewish communities with organizations and infrastructures, fought Palestinian revolutions and killed their leaders, and went on with their oppression to the extent that 10% of Palestinian men in 1940, 10%, were either killed, exiled, or arrested. In addition, Britain planted racist ideas against the natives of the occupied land. The British taught Jews all the bad things, but there was one thing left. The thing that the Jews would learn from the British was the whole colonization thing. It's nice, why not? And indeed, the Zionist colonial ambition rises more. The other thing that the British helped the Zionists with was developing the necessary military force to achieve that ambition. In 1937, a commission was created called the Peel Commission. They would suggest dividing the land between 1 million Arabs and 400,000 Jews, 1/3 for the Jews and 2/3 for the Arabs. The thing is that Palestinians were literally everywhere. So they would be a majority even in the Jewish areas. Churchill in front of that committee would call Palestinians dogs in a manger. We can kick them out. Britain didn't go through with the committee's suggestion. They wanted to, but they retracted. However, the professor of history at Oxford University, Eugene Rogan, says that the Peel Commission were the first to suggest the idea of expulsion. You shouldn't just buy lands and create closed communities. You should force the people out of their land and create religiously and ethnically unified places for other people. Do you think it stops here? The point is that the colonial ambition of the Zionist movement started to develop. Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leaders sat down and thought, to be honest, the expulsion idea was nice. But what if instead of forcing them out of 1/3 of the Palestinian land, we forced them out of Palestine entirely? Later on, the director of the Jewish agency, Joseph White, said, "And you should listen carefully, there will be no land for two peoples." The settlers' ambitions grew so far past the British themselves. The second thing that the Jewish settlers learned from the British was the necessary violent power needed to achieve that ambition. It all took place gradually. From 1937 to 1939, the Jews would, and hear this, they would do exceptional terrorist acts. You must mean terrorism metaphorically, right? I mean it in a literal way, my friend. Like the terrorism we hear about on TV. They sent bombed cars to Haifa and Jerusalem markets that killed more than 70 Palestinians. All that was under the supervision of the British. Again, please go check the sources. It's all from inside the Israeli media. Because this episode specifically heavily depended on Israeli sources. Anyway, you know what Britain did while watching all that happen? They increased the number of soldiers in Palestine to 25,000 soldiers. They killed 5,000 Palestinians and arrested another 9,000. In conditions described by Eugene Rogan as concentration camps. However, despite all that British spoiling, Britain was just like any other empire. It won't be there forever. For the Jews to protect their interests, they had to have an independent army to avoid having their fate linked to Britain forever, especially with a conflict of interest wavering at the horizon. Because with the beginning of World War II in 1939, Britain, hear this out, would limit the Jewish immigrations to Palestine. Shame on them. And they put the limit of 15,000 immigrants yearly to try and reduce the tension in the Arab region to stay focused on their war with Hitler. World War II was already in full swing, and real oppression against the Jews was taking place in Europe at its time. You might think that this moment created a conflict between the parties, but with the beginning of the war, 15,000 Jewish soldiers joined the British Army and participated in World War II. I'm telling you this information because that's where they gained great experience. They were training with the British Army against German Army, and they get that experience of this training to use it later on, the Jewish militia. These groups that used to do terrorist and these acts would slowly turn into organized military structures, like their most famous one, which I mentioned before, Haganah, and other groups like Stern and Ergon. The Haganah would transform from a gang to an army that owns an air force. According to the historian Ilan Pappé, with the Zionist movement owning an organized military force, it will start to ask themselves, why do expulsion when they can annihilate? Why expel Arabs? Let's exterminate them. Palestinians have proved that they wouldn't stop revolting or fighting back. Even if we managed to expel them, they would always come back. Sorry, but this land is just for us, just for Jews. That's why, while the British Army was fighting systematically, the Jewish Zionist gangs were training on a different kind of war. The British General Order Wingate was the first one to train Jews on the occupation of villages and on something called the guerrilla warfare. According to Ilan Pappé, Orde was the first to implant in Zionist consciousness the idea of ethnic cleansing, to the point that Moshe Dayan would describe Wingate as the first master. At that time, the Zionist gangs would start studying the geography of every Palestinian village and knowing its entrances and exits in preparation for storming it later to be able to purify it. That's what Ilan Pappé calls the Village File Project. The European Jewish immigrants grew up, learned things, and had a trained military that can put plans. And there was a feeling that Britain is indeed an ally, but the war was hindering their interests in Palestine. Imagine, they limited the number of Jewish immigrants. Shame! Zionists witnessed some disunion across themselves, An opinion was led by David Ben-Gurion, who saw that he was against limiting the immigrations, but Britain was still an ally to Zionist plans. Oppositely, an opinion was led by the gangs of Argonne and Stern that Britain, under the pressure of war and fear of tension in the Arab region, became an obstacle in the way of the Zionist project. The tension reached its peak when the French Patriot ship docked near Haifa port, and it had more than 1,800 Jewish immigrants without Britain's approval. That's when the Zionist gangs blew up one side of the ship and sacrificed 240 Jewish passengers to force British authorities to let the remaining 1,560 Jewish passengers in. Someone will ask, so they blew up the ship and murdered some of the people they want to bring in, to force Britain to let the rest in? My dear viewer, let me tell you that a negotiation took place between Stern and the Nazis, who went and met in Lebanon to form an alliance. Imagine that. The Nazis who made concentration camps, holocausts, and a Jewish eradication in Europe. The Zionist Stern militia was trying to form an alliance with them, and they actually met in Lebanon just because they thought it would meet their interests. Again, these aren't my words. These are Eugene Rogan's words, the history and Middle East professor in Oxford University.